Hey, here's a great prayer for you. Lord, play me like Christy plays that piano. Wouldn't that be a good prayer to pray? Our homecoming story today is of particular consequence to the nation of Israel because it is in fact the narrative behind the name. Israel is named after the patriarch Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. In one of the most famous and divine encounters of the Bible, the patriarch Jacob would be renamed Israel because of his midnight match with a messenger that many believe to have been the pre-incarnate Christ. It's a remarkable story of intrigue, betrayal, deception, escape, estrangement, terror, but also of hope, faith, forgiveness, and transformation. And it's all wrapped up in a name, or actually in two names, both belonging to the same man, though he would not have been recognized as the same person. In the famous play of William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, the unforgettable line is given life and breath by Juliet when in Act 2, Scene 2, she speaks to Romeo. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. A beautiful and true sentiment that the nature of a thing is not changed by the mere changing of a name. But our story today is not so much about a change of name, but a change of nature. The story is literally about a change of heart, a transformation of the soul, the metamorphosis of a life. Jacob became Israel. The one who swindles became the one who surrenders. Truth be told, we all need a new name, but more importantly, a new nature. As we explore Jacob's journey today, I'll point out the milestone markers that could transform your life as well. And at the end of the message, I'll give you a formula that will help you accurately decipher your identity and a secret that gives you the power to change it. Coming home, biblical stories of those who found their way back to God. And this morning, Jacob's journey, the story of how Israel got its name. The story is told in the chapters 25 through 32 of the book of Genesis. Jacob's journey to becoming Israel can be summarized in 4 stages. Jacob's name, Jacob's game, Jacob's pain, and ultimately Jacob's fame. Let's start by examining Jacob's name and the circumstances surrounding his birth. In Genesis chapter 25, beginning in verse 19, we read about the origin of Jacob's life. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife. This was Jacob's father, because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will actually serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. It's reminiscent of the word red. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, the grasper, the manipulator. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Oh my goodness, 60, and these boys born to Rebekah. So we learn at the beginning of this parental prayer, Jacob's mother and father both were godly people. It reveals their connection with God, how they were not able to bear children, and Jacob intercedes, Isaac intercedes, and so Rebekah is able to conceive, and she's pregnant, but she feels something wrestling in her, and so she goes to the Lord in prayer, and God gives her this revelation. You have two nations in you, and this is important, the younger is going to rule over the older. This is countercultural against the expectation of the day. This prenatal positioning, and sure enough, when Esau is born, this hairy one, Jacob is holding on to his heel. He's trying to climb the ladder already to get ahead of his brother. So Esau and Jacob, that I affectionately refer to as hairy and sly, because that's what their names meant, were shaped by their family of origin. And what was true of Jacob and Esau, or hairy and sly, is certainly true for each one of us. As we seek to really get a handle on our identity, it starts with our family of origin. And for Jacob particularly, he and Esau both were blessed to have both a mother and father who were spiritually inclined, who were connected with God. And their life is literally birthed in the revelation and the intimacy of a relationship with God. What I'd like for you to do this morning, if you're online, you could just comment on Facebook there, or if you're here in our studio audience, just take that card and write out list of value that has been imprinted on you by your family. That's some way to begin to think about the influence of your family of origin. Maybe it was a great family, maybe it was a horrible family, maybe you don't know who your dad is, maybe there's ambiguity about it, but without question, each one of us, our identity is in part shaped by our family of origin experience. So list some value that's a part of your life today. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not so good, but it's been imprinted on you by your family of origin. Jacob was influenced by his family of origin, but that was only part of his identity journey. Jacob made his own choices and thus bears responsibility for his own path, as each of us do. So next we look at Jacob's game and the pattern of manipulation that he developed in his life. Now, Jacob had no control over what he was named or how he was born or to whom he was born. That's family of origin stuff. But this next part of his identity is really his own developing. So we're going to look at Jacob's game, and of course this is a play off of his name, Yaakov, the swindler, the manipulator, the deceiver, the grasper, and see the choices that Jacob made in his own life. Jacob's game of manipulation is told in chapters 25 through 28 of Genesis, and is illustrated by three deceptive stories woven out of the circumstances of his life. One that I'll point you to, I call Jacob the swindler, in Genesis 25 verses 29 through 34. This is the story of how Jacob swindles his older brother Esau out of his spiritual blessing that was his by birthright. That was his because he was the firstborn. In Genesis chapter 25 verse 34, there's a familiar phrase here to many of us. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate it and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, though, behind the scenes, Jacob, the swindler, was already at work. I mean, I can only imagine. The Bible describes Esau as he was the original wild side. He was the original Wayne Sharp. He loved being out in the wild, and he was a hunter. And in fact, that was what he had been doing all day long. He had been out hunting wild game. And of course, he was caught up in that hunt and hadn't eaten all day. Perhaps Jacob, recognizing that situation, one can only imagine he had been plotting about this opportunity. And so Jacob, who had learned the cuisine secrets from his mother, he had concocted quite a stew. So he's got this stew and this brew set up. One can only imagine he has it out there just so the wind can catch it in the direction that his brother Esau is going to be coming back to the family tents. And sure enough, at the end of a long day's hunt, here comes Esau, and he catches the aroma of what Jacob has cooked up, and he is famished. And he says, "Man, brother, give me some of that food." And Jacob says, "I'll be glad to fill you full, but first sell me your birthright." And Esau says, "What good is this birthright to me? It can't fill my belly. I'm about to starve." Jacob says, "Sell me the birthright." And Esau says, "Fine, it's yours." And he sits down and satiates himself on the physical food. And that's what the Bible describes. So Esau despised his birthright. But it was certainly Jacob who was orchestrating and manipulating the situation. This was the original Hunger Games. Long before the movie came out, Jacob was setting up these Hunger Games, and he offered, long before McDonald's, he offers the original meal deal to his brother Esau. And Esau took the bait and sells his birthright. A second story that illustrates Jacob's game of manipulation, Jacob the deceiver, the story is told in Genesis chapter 27 that his father Isaac had almost lost all of his sight, couldn't make much out. And he says to his oldest son, "I want you to go out today and I want you to find some of that wild game and cook it up like I like, so that I can give you my blessing before I die." And Jacob and Esau's mother, Rebekah, hears Isaac offer this to Esau. And she is intent that Jacob have the blessing, the inheritance, instead of Esau. And so she calls for Jacob and says, "Quick, I want you to go out and get one of the goats, and I'll cook it up like your father loves, and you go in before Esau gets back so that you'll have the blessing." Well, remember, Jacob had already cheated and swindled Esau out of it, but clearly his father Isaac was still intent on honoring the custom of giving the blessing and passing it down by the oldest son in the family. Jacob, though he clearly wants this blessing, he says, "What if my father realizes that I'm trying to deceive him? It'll bring down a curse upon me." And Rebekah said, "Let that curse come on me. Just do what I tell you." And so they concoct this. And then you remember Harry and Sly. Well, Sly says, "Dad can't see the difference between me and Esau, but he certainly can feel the difference, and he'll he'll grab hold of me and realize I'm not hairy like Harry is, and he'll realize that we're trying to deceive him. So they take the skin of the goat they're cooking and plaster it around Jacob's arms to deceive Isaac. And incredibly, the game works. This is the original skins game that Jacob and Rebekah are playing. And because of Isaac's failure of sight, it works. He hears the voice and he says, I hear the voice of Esau, but it's the skin of, it's hairy. This must be Esau, and I'm smelling the aroma of the food that I love, and so Isaac is deceived by what is presented to him. So here the second time, Jacob is establishing a pattern of life for himself that fulfills his name, the sly one, the deceiver, the manipulator. He manipulates his brother, and then he manipulates his father. And then in another story in Genesis 27 and 28, we see Jacob the runner. Of course, when this happens and Isaac is convinced this must be my oldest son Esau, he gives him the spiritual blessing. And not a second or two after Jacob leaves and the blessing has been bestowed upon him, Esau makes his way in to the family tent and says, Father, I've cooked up the meal for you. I'm ready for your blessing. And he said, who are you? And he said, why, I'm Esau, your firstborn. And then Isaac trembles, realizing that Jacob, and he probably recognized that Rebekah was part of the scheme, but that he had given the blessing. And by the sacred tradition of the verbal affirmation, it could not be revoked. This, of course, enrages Esau, that now he realizes he has to pay the piper. Years ago, perhaps it had been when Jacob bartered with him for the inheritance, and he had long since forgotten it. But now he realizes there's no recourse, and he weeps bitterly, and that bitterness seeps down into his soul, and he's so angry at Jacob. In verse 41 of chapter 27, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I'll kill my brother Jacob. Now, this was the original fight or flight instinct, and this death wish that Esau is consoling himself. The only way he can get any sense of peace over what's happened to him is to determine, I'm going to kill my brother, but I'll honor my father. He's about to die. He's on his deathbed. Esau thought, I'll wait till he dies, and then I'll get my revenge on my brother. He's not going to have that inheritance. I'm going to kill him as soon as Dad's off the stage. When Rebekah hears about this death wish, she complains to her husband Isaac and says, I hate these women that Esau has married from the region. And it'll just drive me crazy if Jacob marries one of these women. I want you to send him back to my home, back in Haran. You remember Abraham had left Ur of the Chaldees with his father Terah, and they'd come to Haran where Abraham's father died, and then they continued that divine pilgrimage to the promised land from Genesis chapter 12. And so Isaac concurs, and he calls for Jacob. And he says, look, your mother and I don't want you marrying one of the women around here. We want you to go back and get good stock. Go back to where your mother came from and find a wife for you there. And Rebekah says, I will send for you, she says to Jacob, when your brother's fury has subsided. And so Jacob, in a sense, now is reaping the harvest of his own deceptive ways as he's forced to leave home. So this is the second element in the identity journey. I want you to take a moment online and just comment, if you would, something of the circumstances of life that you have experienced. And I want you to list a decision or a practice or a habit that has shaped who you are. Remember, family of origin, you don't have anything to do with that. That's given to you. But the circumstances of life are about our experience. So online, I want you to comment, and on site, I want you to use the card and just list a decision that you have made, a practice that you have had, a habit that you have developed that has influenced who you are. Because certainly it was true for Jacob. He was influenced by his family of origin, but then all those years as he experiences life, as he responds to the circumstances of life, he's shaping his own identity. He's bearing responsibility for who he is and who he is becoming. Influenced by his family of origin, Jacob develops his personal approach to life and inevitably faces some tough times and deep hurts. Having explored Jacob's name and Jacob's game, let's look now into Jacob's pain and uncover some of those hurts and hang-ups that impact Jacob's journey of discovery. So this is Jacob's pain, the story told in Genesis 28 through 31. Notice verse 10 of chapter 28. Jacob left Beersheba, that's the southern part of Israel, where he'd grown up, and set out for Haran. You can see a map of that journey for Jacob here, and down at the bottom of the map you see on the left Beersheba, and Jacob is going all the way up to Haran, where his grandfather Abraham had lived for a short time as he had halted for a while until his father passed away and then made his way to the promised land. So you can see how far north Jacob is going to escape from his brother's fury and be estranged from his family. There are four particular pains in Jacob's estrangement from his family. Let's think about that for a moment. I mean, here's a boy that grew up in a family, in a godly family, in tight relationships, and now one is the loneliest number. He's going to be cast out from his family, in part because of his own manipulations. He has to flee for his life. We know that Jacob was about 15 years old when his grandfather Abraham had died. We don't know exactly how old he is here when he leaves home, but he's on his own, without mother or father, without his brother, and without the familiarity of his family surroundings. So he's definitely alone. On that journey, he'll make his way all the way north to Haran, as we've seen, and there he will find his mother's family. But if you're familiar with the story, the swindler gets swindled. It's rather ironic what happens to the grasper, because he gets caught in the intrigue of his father-in-law, Laban, who is actually his uncle, his mother's brother. And you remember he gets there, he doesn't have anything. He's from a wealthy family, but he has nothing. And so he barters to work for 7 years. He falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. And because he has no dowry, he strikes a deal to work 7 years for Laban to give Rachel in marriage to Jacob. But after the 7 years are ended and the marriage feast is given and they consummate the marriage, Jacob wakes up the next morning and lo and behold, it's not Rachel, it's her older sister Leah that he has married in the night. That must have been quite a party and a bit of a drunken stupor, you might imagine, that he didn't even recognize who he was sleeping with. Then, because of that masquerade marriage, of course, Jacob didn't love Leah, he loved Rachel. He still didn't have anything. And so Laban strikes a deal. He manipulates Jacob a second time and says, listen, just finish out this marriage week for Leah, because that's our custom. The older has to marry first. And then I'll give you Rachel also for another 7 years of labor. So 14 years Jacob is working, and he gets Rachel as his wife 7 years and 1 week after he gets there. But he has to work another 7 years to pay off his dowry for Rachel. And then begins the spousal strife, as you can only imagine. Jacob loved Rachel. He resented that he was manipulated to have to marry Leah and then work for an additional 7 years for her. And so these two sisters began to vie for their husband's affections. And it's Leah who is blessed of God to have children. She has Jacob's first 4 children, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And after those 4 children, Rachel's not able to have children at all. She's so frustrated that she decides, well, I'll give my handmaiden to my husband, because any children my handmaiden has will be almost like my own. And so Jacob, he doesn't have to work at this. He gets wife number 3. And Bilhah then gives Jacob his 5th and 6th sons, Dan and Naphtali. And then when Leah realizes that this has happened, it some way sparks her womb, and she has a couple of more children, Issachar and Zebulun, and then she gives her handmaid to her husband. So now Jacob has 4 wives. He's going to have 12 sons and 1 daughter, and you can imagine the spousal strife that this circus inspires for Jacob. Quite a lot of conflict there. At the end of 20 years, Jacob now has been separated from his mother and father, from his family of origin, and made his own family in Haran. But he's dealing with his in-laws and his outlaws, as they say, because there's a lot of family strife between he and Laban, as you might imagine. As Jacob steals away 20 years later to return home, Laban chases after him. And when he catches up to Jacob with the power to take all of his family away from him, Jacob says to him, I've been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I didn't bring your animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. I don't think that meant raises either. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. Well, you can see Jacob had a lot of hurts and hang-ups. They shaped his life, partly by his family of origin, partly by his circumstances of life, and partly by the hurts and the hang-ups that he developed by wrongly responding to the things that happened to him. What I'd like for you to do is you think about your identity. Online, you can just comment, and on site, use your card. List a hurt or a conflict that's impacted you deeply. Some kind of hurt or conflict, a hang-up in the past that still overshadows your life. Well, that's the story of Jacob. Jacob's journey was marked by the influence of his family of origin, his circumstances of life, his hurts and hang-ups. But praise God, most importantly, he's going to be imprinted by his encounters with God. This is what Jacob is remembered for and what transformed him into a great man of God. So finally, let's look now at Jacob's fame, what he's remembered for in Genesis chapter 32. This is about his famous wrestling with the angel of God. In chapter 32, after he dispenses with his father-in-law Laban, now he's making his way back to Beersheba, to his father's home. But he receives word in Genesis 32 that his brother Esau is on his way with 300 men. And Jacob concludes, this is not a welcoming party. This is the payday that my brother swore to when I deceived him and got his blessing. And that's why I ran away 20 years ago, and he's coming to get his vengeance now. And so in an incredible scene, Jacob divides his family, his 13 children, and his 13th Benjamin hadn't been born quite yet. He's still in the womb. But he divides his wives, his handmaidens that became his wives, and their children, and all of his flocks, and Jacob sends them over the Jabbok River. This is one of the great delights of my life, to have forded the Jabbok River where Jacob does this. Here's a picture of it right here. The fords of the Jabbok. You can see the tall mountain in the background, but below it, about halfway up, you can barely make out the mound. That's Mahanaim. That means in Hebrew, the 2 camps. So it's here at Mahanaim, and then on the other side, this peak is going to be named Penuel. In Arabic today, it's called Tulul al-Dahab, the twin mountains of gold, because of their divine significance. The angels of God meet Jacob, and he calls the place Mahanaim, and then he sends all of his family across the Jabbok River. And that night, Genesis 32 says, Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled with him a man till the break of dawn. Many believe that man that Hosea says was the angel of the Lord was the pre-incarnate Christ. And it's the famous story that Jacob the swindler now comes to the end of his rope, and there's no way he can scheme his way out of this crisis, and he wrestles with God, and the angel says, let me go, and Jacob says, I'm not letting go unless you bless me. And the angel says, what is your name? And he confesses, my name is sly, my name is swindler, my name is deceiver, my name is manipulator. And the angel says, you will no longer be referred to as sly, as the manipulative one. You will be called Israel, because now you are a prince for having wrestled with God. And Jacob's name is changed to reflect the change of his heart. That he finally came to the place that the most important thing in life was not to blame his family of origin, or to blame his circumstances of life, or to stay in his hurts and hang-ups, but to say, I'm going to lay hold of God and I'm going to become a different person. I'm going to find a new identity and I'm going to ground it in God. Isn't that marvelous? And in this marvelous scene, as Jacob wrestles with God, he's shaped by this divine encounter. I want to encourage you to think about some verse or spiritual experience that you've had with God that has changed your life. And if you can't think of one, perhaps to cry out to God to say, God, this is what I need. You alone can change my nature. Any of us could go to the courthouse and change our legal name, but we don't have the power to change our nature. Only an encounter with God can do that. So in conclusion, let me show you that formula that I promised you. Remember, we've talked about family of origin and circumstances of life and hurts and hang-ups and encounters with God. Well, here's the formula that really shapes every person's identity. I think we have a picture of it. Maybe we don't. But if you just take those four, family of origin, that's FOO, plus circumstances of life, COL, plus hurts and hang-ups, plus encounters with God. That's your identity. Of course, you may not have any encounters with God, but you could. That makes up your current and future identity. It's a mathematical formula that is true for every person who ever lived. These four things combined make up your current and your future identity. But you remember I told you I'd give you a secret that could change your identity? So you are the collective combination of your family of origin, your circumstances of life, your hurts and hang-ups, and your encounters with God. But here's the secret. Because you've been made in the image of God, you get to determine the factor of each one of those elements. See, there's some people in life, and they put the lion's share of their identity in their family of origin. And maybe they have a bad family of origin. Maybe they felt abandoned. Maybe they didn't feel loved. And that's primarily what they use, and they give that 80% of their identity as their family of origin. But that's the secret. You have the power to say, I'm going to make it a bigger part or a smaller part of my identity. And the same thing with the circumstances of life. You can't change those, but you have the power to factor it into your identity, to make more of it or less of it by the grace of God. And your hurts and hang-ups, we can't change how we've been hurt by others, but we have the power to factor in how much influence that's going to have on our present and our future. And the best part of all, because God is so loving and so gracious and desires deeply an intimate relationship with all of us, we each can say, I'm going to make the lion's share of my current and future identity my encounters with the living God. And every day we can say, God, today I want to walk with you. I want to know you. I want to serve you. I want to love you. And regardless, for me personally, I had a great family of origin. But even more than my family of origin, I want to be identified by my encounters with God. I've had incredible circumstances of life. I've traveled the globe. I've lived in different cultures. I've explored the Bible lands. But more than that, I'm going to put the greatest factor for my identity to be my encounters with God. I've been hurt before I was a Christian. I've been hurt as a Christian. I've been hurt as a pastor. But I have the power to say, I'm going to minimize the influence of those hurts in my past. And I'm going to put the lion's share of my identity today and the future. I'm going to push all my chips onto my encounter with God. And I'm going to make sure that I never waste another day in my life that I don't come face to face. That's what Penuel means. That's what Jacob named that second mountain. I've seen the face of God and I've survived. Now, I do need to give full disclosure here. Jacob, the good part is Jacob was never the same again from that midnight wrestling match. But every step Jacob took the rest of his life, there was some physical pain there, because that angel had touched his hip and threw it out of joint. And for the rest of his life, Jacob remembered the glory of the face of God, but he felt a little pain in that hip when he walked. There is a price to be paid to come face to face with God. It's not a painless path. It's not an easy path, but it's a glorious path. And I'm telling you, there is hope for you to become someone different. As we conclude, I want to challenge you. If you've never had the kind of encounter with God that can change your life, I want you to call out to the Lord today. God, I need to meet you. I need you to change my heart, change my nature, change my life. That's what God can do for you. Just call upon the name of the Lord right now, and let this be your signature moment of wrestling with God. Or maybe as a Christian, you realize through this message that you've given way too much weight to your family of origin that wasn't very healthy. You've given way too much weight to your circumstances of life that haven't been very favorable. You've given way too much importance to the hurts and the hang-ups of your past. And today you ought to say, God, I'm going to be defined by my relationship with you and my response to you from this day forward. Wouldn't that be marvelous? God could change your name today and change your nature. Well, if God's spoken to you, I'd love to hear about it. You can address me at scott@meadowsbaptist.org. If you don't have a pastor, if you don't have a church home, we'd welcome you to become part of our global Meadows family. So reach out to me and I'll certainly be praying for you and connect with you personally this week. I want to leave you with this benediction blessing as we think about Jacob's journey and the marvelous encounter with God that changed his life. So may this be your experience today. May you be wise to recognize the influences that have shaped your life. And may you be strong to break the chains of your past. May you be humble to seek God's help and friendship. And may you be courageous to become more than you presently are and all that God has designed you to be. In Jesus' name. God bless you. I'll see you soon.